The immediate impact of the disqualification was seismic. Norris, who had finished second on the road, and Piastri, who had originally crossed the line in fifth before gaining a position due to Kimi Antonelli's penalty, were both removed from the final classification after FIA technical delegates measured the rearmost skid wear on the MCL 39 and found it below the minimum 9mm thickness. The regulation is black and white. Anything under the limit is illegal, intent is irrelevant, and the penalty is disqualification. McLaren argued mitigating circumstances: the unexpected porpoising caused by the track, the limited practice time due to weather, the shortened Friday running. But the stewards dismissed all of it. The FIA did, however, note that they believed the breach was unintentional. But unintended or not, the consequences were enormous. The points reset that followed was arguably the most dramatic twist of the season. With Norris left on 390, both Verstappen and Piastri now sit tied behind him on 366. Suddenly, what looked like a straightforward run-in for McLaren became a three-way knife fight heading into Qatar and Abu Dhabi. The problem for McLaren is that this wasn't a freak administrative error or an ambiguous interpretation of the rules. It was a fundamental aspect of car legality. And as several analysts pointed out, no other team in the top 10 had the same issue. That's where the narrative begins to harden. Scott Mitchell-Malm called it a spectacular blunder, questioning how McLaren failed to anticipate plank wear on a bumpy street circuit. If the team had no clue it was vulnerable, why did they react so late with Norris, and not at all with Piastri? If they did suspect a problem, why did their response differ between cars? Ben Anderson added that the team's inability to stay on the right side of plank legality was now a genuine threat to Norris's title, especially with Ferrari collapsing form-wise and Piastri stuck in a prolonged slump. Val Corunzi was blunter, describing the DSQ as a mistake that could destroy McLaren's nerves heading into a potential final race decider. But the most pointed observation came from Gary Anderson, who noted that the fact both cars were non-compliant shows that even a team good enough to win the Constructors' Championship can still commit basic, costly errors. He emphasised that the momentum is now firmly with Verstappen, and that Piastri, whether he wants to help or not, is unlikely to be a meaningful support to Norris, especially given their clashes earlier in the season. This all feeds into a broader unease about how McLaren have managed their drivers in recent months. From a championship lead of more than 30 points after Zandvoort, Piastri has endured a string of difficult races: crashes in Azerbaijan, no podium since Monza, grid penalties elsewhere, and repeated complaints about being stuck in traffic due to strategy calls that seem to leave him exposed. His performance slump is a matter of record, but so too is the mounting perception that the team hasn't offered him the same level of strategic clarity or support. When asked before the DSQ about the title fight, team principal Andrea Stella made a point of saying that Oscar needs to go into the final two races with the will to win them. It sounded motivational, but in context, it raised eyebrows. Why did this need to be said publicly? Why was the emphasis placed on Piastri proving himself rather than the team evaluating its own choices? And then came the Instagram incident. Piastri's account reposted Bernie Ecclestone's quote, asserting McLaren prefer Norris because he brings more marketing value. It was deleted quickly. Piastri later said he didn't know anything about it and that maybe I accidentally did it. The explanation is plausible. Top drivers often have social media managers, but the timing was almost too convenient. For a fan base already primed to see signs of imbalance inside McLaren, this felt like confirmation, even if it wasn't. If there's one thing McLaren have consistently managed this season, it's creating problems they really didn't need. And in Las Vegas, they outdid themselves. Both cars were disqualified for a technical breach so basic that even midfield teams rarely get caught by it. To many observers, this wasn't just another error. It looked like a team so preoccupied with managing its internal storyline that it forgot to monitor something fundamental. For those already suspicious that McLaren have been quietly shaping the path for Lando Norris's title bid, the double DSQ felt like the moment the entire facade cracked. everything previously brushed off as speculation, from skewed strategic calls to the resurfaced Bernie Ecclestone comment claiming McLaren prefer the English driver Norris because he offers more marketing appeal, suddenly appeared a lot more coherent, not as confirmed truth but as a reflection of how McLaren's behaviour has looked from the outside. And the harshest twist came from Red Bull's camp. Helmut Marko had openly hinted that Verstappen only needed one major slip-up from McLaren to bring the championship back within reach. He said that before the disqualification. And hours later, that's exactly what unfolded. Marko didn't bother hiding his amusement. In his own words, when McLaren instructed Norris to attack Max, Verstappen responded with one fastest lap after another, something Marko found comically inevitable. To him, the entire situation looked like the consequence of a team trying far too hard to control an outcome that didn't need controlling. With all that in mind, one question now hangs over the entire situation. Is this simply incompetence, or a case of McLaren tripping over their own agenda? Before we dive deeper into what really happened and why this DSQ has detonated so many suspicions, consider subscribing. It helps us grow the channel and lets you stay updated as we unpack stories like this in depth. Las Vegas only cemented the suspicion. On the opening lap, Piastri was hit by Liam Lawson and dropped back, but his recovery drive was limited by a combination of small errors, tyre issues, and being stuck behind Antonelli. He described the race as eventful and said there were a few too many mistakes, but he also pointed out that he was one of the only people who actually braked to make the corner at turn 1. It's the kind of subtle frustration that has crept into his radio messages and interviews recently, rarely aggressive, but unmistakably tired. Norris, meanwhile, had his own drama. The formation lap games between him and Verstappen, with Norris complaining he's taking the piss with how big of a gap he's leaving, may have unsettled him. At turn 1, he admitted he braked too late and messed it up, losing the lead immediately. After that, even before the DSQ, Norris conceded Red Bull were in another league, which brings us back to Marko. His commentary throughout the weekend was revealing. He said Verstappen took the first corner supremely, that the team controlled tyre wear better, and that the setup they chose on good luck turned out to be ideal. But he saved his sharpest line for McLaren's radio message telling Norris to attack Verstappen. And then he hammered in one fastest lap after another, just to make things clear. Marko thrives on psychological games, he always has. And this time, McLaren handed him the perfect storyline, the team pushing Norris into a losing fight only to lose far more than the race. The broader technical picture makes McLaren look even worse. Motorsport.com's analysis highlighted that the MCL39 setup may have shifted its balance rearwards to extract performance on the Las Vegas layout, making the plank more vulnerable to wear. The track was bumpy, the weekend disrupted, and the ride height window tight. But the other 9 teams managed it. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were disqualified for similar offences back in Austin 2023, yet the lesson seems not to have stuck in Woking. With a car as stiffly sprung as the MCL39, curb strikes, tyre degradation and fuel load all contribute to wear. But that's the case for everyone. It is the combination of all these elements, the technical misstep, the strategic inconsistencies, the psychological noise, the optics of favouritism, that creates the environment where people start talking about McLaren playing dirty. Not as a factual accusation, but as a reading of the pattern. McLaren might argue that the DSQ was simple misfortune, but misfortune repeated often enough stops looking like coincidence. And that's where the suspicion grows. Not because anyone can prove McLaren intended to bend the rules, but because everything around the team right now feels off. The pressure to secure Norris's first title, the visible frustration from Piastri, the public amusement from Red Bull, it all adds up to a story that McLaren can't control anymore. Which leads to one final question, the one the paddock is already whispering. After a season spent managing optics, expectations and internal politics, has McLaren become its own biggest enemy? And will this title slip not because of Red Bull or Ferrari, but because the team simply couldn't stay out of its own way?